Thank you, Adam. I'd like to thank the organizers as well. Actually, I'm one of the organizers, but as you probably know, some organizers are more equal than others, and I'm definitely the less equal organizer here. I would like to thank everybody involved in the research that I'm presenting today. These are the people from Mossakowski Medical Research Institute, that's down there 2 blocks away. And we have some help from Paweł and Jakub as well. I will present some old experiments and some new data from fear conditioning experiments. In our lab, we have a setup with playback experiments. In this setup, the rat is receiving pre-recorded ultrasonic vocalizations from the speaker. These are 50 kilohertz vocalizations and 22 kilohertz vocalizations, and we look for responses of the rat. The playback lasts for 10 seconds. And then we look for 4 kinds of responses. These are the locomotor activity, the amount of time rat is spending in the half of the cage where the speaker was, the amount of the number of vocalizations in response to the playback, and the heart rate. In our first publication, where when we proposed this model, we were happy to see that the amount of vocalizations is really high in response to playback, especially in case of 50 kilohertz vocalizations playback. And we also noted that there is a big difference in heart rate changes, those caused by 50 kilohertz vocalizations, the heart rate rises, and in case of 22 kilohertz vocalizations playback, the heart rate drops down. In our second publication, we wanted to see what was the effect of previous fear conditioning. So we fear conditioned the animals the day before the playback experiments. The animals received 1, 6, or 10 fear trials, and we are actually expecting those mice to be stressed and less willing to talk, to respond. And as usual, the opposite happened. The amount of vocalizations was higher in animals that were previously food shocked. In the following publication, we investigated spontaneously hypertensive rats. This is related to yesterday's topic of animal models of human diseases, which is in case of SHR. These are hypertension rats, model of essential hypertension, as well as it's treated as a possible model of ADHD and schizophrenia. And both conditions are also manifested by speech impairments. And we were lucky and happy to see that again the response in our rats SHR were lower than in control visitor rats. So we pretty excited to look at these rats as the model of the diseases. So that was the first part of the talk. Then we looked again on the vocalizations that were happening during fear conditioning. So what I was telling you before is the changes in vocalizations in response to playback. But what happened during the fear conditioning itself really struck us. We noticed something, and we would like to share it with you. You will hear and see 22 vocalizations for some time, then a little break, and there's something new. I'm sorry, I can't hear it. There was only one call, and then Yeah. Right. Could you hear it? So I hope we've heard the difference between the first call and the other call. I'm sorry about the problems. So there were calls that were as long as the 22 kilohertz vocalizations, but where they were higher in frequency, and I hope you could have heard it. So what we observed in our results were a new group of unknown to us calls, and when you graph those calls, you can see here are the 50 kilohertz vocalizations that were emitted during playback experiment, and here's the rat's emission during the fear conditioning part of the experiment, with some 50 kilohertz vocalizations, some short 22 kilohertz vocalizations, and some typical long 22 kilohertz vocalizations. And we have also observed rats that had this group of vocalizations that were long, that were high in frequency, and that was not and there were many of such cases. Several animals displayed this group of calls, and when we analyze all vocalizations from the whole experiment, and we try to see whether this group is clustering, is making a separate group, it actually kept to be separate as a last one. So all the other groups merged into one group of calls, and changing the epsilon in a dbScan algorithm, we managed to keep this group as a separate cluster. And we called them 44 kilohertz since the middle of this cluster was at around 44 kilohertz. Obviously, there is a relation between 22 and 44 that luckily was there too. And to talk about more about these vocalizations, we observed them after several shocks. So basically, in some animals, they really not happening or very rare. In others, they appear during training, usually after 5th or 6th trial. It's always less of those vocalizations compared to 22 kilohertz vocalizations, but we think that they somehow replace these 22 vocalizations. We see that there's less and less of them. In the whole experiment, still the 44 kilohertz vocalizations, they represented quite a big number of calls. And more precisely, when we analyzed this one group of rats, there were up to 90% of rats expressing 22 kilohertz vocalizations, around 70% of rats expressing 44 kilohertz vocalizations, which constitute up to around 20% of calls during a particular intertrial interval time between shocks. These calls, also we noticed that the frequency of these calls rises through the training. It wasn't fully significant, as was the case with 22 kilohertz vocalizations. We noticed that the frequency of those rises from trial to trial. And we also looked at the mean power of vocalizations, and we noticed that the mean power of 22 kilohertz vocalizations goes down, and while the power of 44 kilohertz vocalization stays stable. And depending on the interpretation of your microphone data, and according to producers' instructions, we argue that these calls are actually stronger and they have bigger mean power than 22 kilohertz vocalizations. In general, the 44 kilohertz vocalizations are flat and long, and they were very similar to 22 kilohertz vocalizations. They are just higher, but they come in other flavors as well, and we call them step ups, step downs, inserts, and complex vocalizations. As you can see, they composed of the elements of both 22 and 44 kilohertz vocalizations, but in general, the flat ones are the main group. Using these shapes, I mean, seeing that they have all kinds of different shapes, we also looked at the different kind of clustering to see whether there's again some separation associated with the calls, 44 calls, and we received something like this helmet-like head structure using deep squeak k-means, and after this UMAP projection and visualization, and this back of the head, all these are 22 kilohertz vocalizations, and flat 44s, they are here on the cheek side. And when we then try to limit the number of clusters that can be shown, always the flat 44s were separate from 22 kilohertz vocalizations. Then we asked whether what's the reaction of rats when they exposed to playback of 44 kilohertz vocalizations. And what we've seen using two separate groups, and when we looked at the answering of rats as the response in vocalizations. So in response to 44 playback, the rats expressed 50 kilohertz calls, and we also looked at their duration, and the results fall in between the results observed for 50 kilohertz calls and 22 kilohertz calls, while where we looked at the heart rate, here the results of we observed the drop characteristic for 22 kilohertz calls as a result of 22 kilohertz playback, and the same change we've seen with 44 kilohertz calls. In contrast to increase in heart rate caused by exposure to 50 kilohertz calls. Why were we seeing this? Why not the others? I'm not sure. Not many people are using fear conditioning, especially for a long time. So again, we've seen our calls after repetitive fear conditioning, stressing, but there are some hints throughout the literature that others might have observed similar tendencies. Here is the paper by Marcus where he is showing high frequencies at some points, especially where the level of shock is the highest. And we were happy to notice that the group from France and Germany observed 44 kilohertz vocalizations in a very similar model, experimental model, fear conditioning with 10 trials as well, which is odor-based. The odor was the condition there, was the stimulus there, and they observed the 44 kilohertz vocalizations towards the end of training after the 8th, 9th, and 10th trial, and these were not present during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. And again, I would now ask you to maybe, as Nicola was suggesting yesterday, to look at your old data. Maybe there is something that we can all look, or you can look at it and decide whether these things are similar to something we described. And we're very open and happy to work on this together, and then maybe analyze it together, and maybe put together something like a paper describing all kinds of situations when 1, 2, 3, or 10 instances of 44 kilohertz calls were observed. And so please contact me if you have something like that. Then we asked the question, are the rats expressing 44 kilohertz vocalizations somehow different from the rats that do not express emit those calls? And so we looked at their heart rate during training, and this heart rate was repeatedly lower in rats that were expressing 44 kilohertz vocalizations, up to the moment when they actually appeared. So up to around the trial 6. But then when we look at the test session, again, the heart rate was lower in these rats, in the rats that were emitting 44 kilohertz vocalizations before, up to the first test presentation of the signal of the test during the test. And also the freezing was lower in these animals. So somehow it reflects their biology, their behavior. This is the summary of the main findings. I will only mention this, that in general, it is observed in the animal kingdom that if the frequency of calls, of the similar calls, increases, it's some kind in general reflects the increase in arousal of the animal. So we have a hypothesis, it's only a hypothesis, that maybe our rats, after being shocked for a longer time, are aroused more than before, and still the sign, the feelings they have are still negative, and 44 just communicate increased negative emotional state. So again, to show a little model, we propose that there are maybe 4 groups to consider, 4 groups of calls, ultrasonic calls that one can consider. We would like to call them types, but it's not crucial how to call them. So obviously we have 50 kilohertz vocalizations, and within this you can see flats and trills, obviously, and you have short 22 kilohertz vocalizations. A little side note that we have a paper in review here by Agnieszka Wardak, where she's showing that rats that learned how to vocalize for food in instrumental conditioning are expressing much less of those short 22 vocalizations in comparisons with rats that didn't learn the task. Obviously, we have 22 calls, and we're proposing 44 kilohertz calls. We have all range of emotions, from sadness to despair, and probably rats have the same, and we have all kinds of ways of showing those emotions. So maybe rats can have just more than 2, and we are proposing third, which is described in reviewed preprint in eLife, and I thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Kuba, for this interesting talk. Are there any questions? Oh, was there? All right. So please.
We were just curious, how similar are these to those juvenile 22s, which are, a bit higher in frequency, which are not really considered 22s? Yeah.
This is a great question. I only recently really started to look at those, so I'm not really sure. But I think they're shorter, the ones expressed by Rafa can answer that.
It's my theory, nothing else. But in case of pop vocalizations, I think that they are in higher frequency because of how their vocalizing apparatus is structured. As well, smaller instruments will produce higher frequencies of sounds. So, as Professor Brudzinski stated that the rats attune their vocalizations to their lowest possible frequency. So I would say that the pop vocalizations are the equivalent of 22 kilohertz calls, but they simply cannot produce lower sounds. But here in adult rats, they are still able to produce 22 kilohertz calls. It's not like that they jump to singularly produce those 44 kilohertz calls, but there's some kind of intermixing that they alternate 22 kilohertz calls, that they vocalize in 44 again, that they drop down again. It's well, in this example that Kuba played back, well, this was a really nice example that those rats that had really sharp switch to those higher frequency calls, but in some cases this phenomenon is more gradual. So I think the answer is that pop calls are more akin, in my opinion, pop calls are more akin to 22 kilohertz calls than those 44 kilohertz calls, but they occur on a similar frequency band. Thank you.
So also some kind of answering you as well is that the rats presented here are really adult, right? So it's that they're not juvenile, just to make sure.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. I find it quite impressive. So I'm wondering whether you can speculate on two aspects, maybe. One is, so the typical 22s, they are around 22, and now the calls that you describe are 44. I guess that's not a coincidence. So I'm wondering what your thought is on that. And the other is, why did we miss them for so long? I mean, there's probably a couple of studies on fear conditioning and things like that. I'm gonna check my files, but
okay, so two questions. Why we missed them, I don't know. So as I said before, maybe they were not conditioned long enough, for example, or you really need some really adversive conditions to have them. However, we also observe them in other contexts, not that adverse. So maybe it's just Warsaw dialect, could be that. And answering your 22 versus 44 question. So we were debating and thinking how to name them, and we did notice that they have the average frequency around 44, and the relationship between 22s and 44s in our case is ideally 1.5. The problem is that 22s are not really at 22. They're higher than that. So when we but when we looked at the relationship between parts of calls, you were seeing that there were parts, 22 like parts and 44 like parts. The average relationship between those is 1.5. And when we have rats that switched from 22s to 44s, and we looked at the groups of calls around this moment, it was also 1.5 case.
Thank you very much. And maybe it's like, yeah, so this is the case. So if you do the conditioning very long, then you've got those 44. Yes, I remember I was when I was in the elementary school, when the guy or everyone is can twist his hand. Yes, so on the beginning it was and then it was the same sharp, but it was a little bit higher. Yes. Yes. All right. We didn't have internet, so we have to do something.